they can't make the changes they need fast enough with a legacy on-premise IT solution. Now, if they had all the time in the world, they maybe the perfect solution for them, at least for near term, might be sort of a hybrid cloud or something like that. But there's just no question right now, the only option they could even consider is the one that is fastest and cheapest. And so, you know, Microsoft Azure is doing fantastic, and Google and Amazon Web Services. And I don't know what the numbers on Google's cloud, but I assume that all the major players are going up. So we're going to see a premium on that. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of innovation around shifting business models that shift to more virtual or more asynchronous or non-face-to-face interactions, both on the customer delivery side, customer interaction, wherever possible. So of course, Netflix is you know, subscriptions are soaring while movie theaters are shrinking, but also on the back end. You know, we're seeing this shift, and it's interesting. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen gone from that sort of crisis mode, oh, everyone's working from home, to companies sort of consolidating and saying what's working, what's not, how do we make this more effective, how do we think, what companies are already thinking about, this is something that's not going to go back entirely as it was before, that they are finding benefits to having made this shift, even if it was overly rushed, shall we say. We're going to see economic pressures. That's another major driver of innovation and value proposition adaptation. You know, there's just, we're in and going to persist, even if, by my reckoning, I'm not an economist, but from everybody I read, even if a vaccine were discovered tomorrow, the economic recession that we're in would not be over in a matter of weeks. So we are in, to some degree, a global economic recession, which it's just going to take time, even in the best scenario on the health side, to just recoup, regain the level of economic activity, consumer confidence, you know, supply chain stability, all these sort of factors. So as a result, everyone is facing cost pressures. And so any innovation that finds, look, there's a way to do what we did before cheaper, and a lot of this is going to be B2B, a lot of it already is going to see tremendous growth. And people are going to do something that they had to do. I mean, I know companies I'm talking to now in services industries, for example, and they say, well, we've had to cut our prices because our customers simply can't pay what they would normally be paying. So we've given them a big discount on this project or all our current projects so that we can keep doing them. So we have some work, but to not lose money, then our own projects, we're having to figure out ways to, you know, dramatically cut our costs and sort of do things differently. But they also are saying, we realize this isn't just going to be a temporary sort of crisis cost cutting, that basically 6 months from now or a year from now, their clients are going to say, you know what, we understand you had to make some changes, but that actually was pretty good service. It was good enough. And we like the price much better. And no, we don't want to go back to the old terms of our contract. And so they're saying, if we are able to push down our costs and we have to change our delivery model, again, these are sort of global services companies, we're going to have to keep pushing in that direction. So in a lot of these factors, we're going to see sort of urgent innovation of necessity that's a little kind of rushed and sloppy in a sense. But I think what we're going to see is a lack of sort of snapping back to saying, oh, well, and again, this is even in the better scenario where there is a sense in the next 12 months of, oh, things are mostly returning to normal on these sort of conditions, that the business models and operations will not snap back 100%. They're only going to revert back to a limited degree. And the last sort of big area I see of innovation is, and this I think is still early, but I am still predicting, is around data. There's just so much necessity of it. I mean, a lot of it's happening behind the scenes. A lot of companies, and that's where some co-opetition is happening in new areas, is of course around really a lot of it literally trying to solve the medical issues, whether it's the science and the vaccines and therapies and so forth, or if it's things like contact tracing and communications and better AI modeling of spreads of disease and so forth. We're seeing new partnerships of necessity around data. And I think we're going to see some, in the current era and in the aftermath, some rethinking of what is the power of some of the data we have? How do we think about how we want it to be used? but a willingness to think about if it is defined in the public good in critical areas that maybe we're willing to, or to define some new boundaries of sort of who gets to use what kind of data where. And obviously this depends on the country you're in and the regulatory framework and the social expectations around privacy. And, some countries, this isn't even a barrier, and in other countries, it is both a cultural and a political barrier. So I think those are some of the big sort of areas where I see, to Virginia's question of sort of where we're going to see a lot of innovation and sort of new value propositions emerging. Co-opetition, I think we're seeing it. I think it's a little like Andy Grove's statement. So I think the companies that already had an attitude and a mindset of competition are doing it even more. A great example of that is Apple and Google, which have been fierce competitors, but also do a lot of business together for many years. Putting this now in order to help contact tracing, trying to put together this plan to connect the Android and the Apple ecosystem for a joint effort. And that's sort of the area where they've been most directly competing and sort of had the least cooperation. So that is sort of like a further step into competition for them. So I think that's an example of that. Those who already understand that thinking, saying, you know what, given the circumstances, we need to push this even a little further. I think companies that don't get it, I so far haven't seen any evidence that they're suddenly waking up to it. I mean, I think those who don't get it, all they think of is the only co-opetition they think of is lobbying. So if you're in a democracy, that means, everyone in your industry getting together and going to the halls of our Congress, or it might be a parliament, and twisting arms and saying, we need a lot of money. That's about the only cooperation with rivals that some legacy industries have ever learned. And that's certainly going on. But I don't think that's what they need to survive ultimately.
Excellent. And we have a good follow-on question from that from Amit has just come through. He says,
great.
We've seen platform-based businesses such as Airbnb, Uber, other delivery platforms and online marketplaces have been letting people go en masse over the last few weeks. Is this part of them being nimble and adaptive, or has something gone wrong with their business models?
Well, they're being nimble and adaptive. I mean, in a brutal, difficult way. But the problem is, look, I'm actually working on a research study looking at digital transformation and COVID and sort of where these intersect. And one of the high theories, this should be coming out in the next couple of months. I mean, we have to survey the data. But our thesis going in is that companies that are already further along in digital transformation and have these attributes of more digital business models and more flexible organizations are performing better. But that is within the context. Not every company is in the same context. And so that's the other part which we're looking at, is that you have to understand, you can't compare an Uber or an Airbnb as a platform business model with Google's ad search as a platform business model, or with Uber Eats, to make Uber driving versus Uber Eats. Well, Uber Eats is doing better and Uber for rides is doing worse. So does that mean one is better run than the other? No, absolutely differently. Not because it's a matter of businesses, and really on the level of business model as well as industry are facing much greater or less pressure, both, and really on sort of two vectors. So one is on the demand side. And so you'd see that there in Uber, between Uber and Uber Eats. So obviously there's just much less demand for rides. That has nothing to do with how well managed Uber is. If you're in a country like the US where you had a legacy taxi cab limousine industry, that industry is facing, that version is facing the same pressure. It's not that, it's just endemic to the offering has a huge drop in demand. So versus Uber Eats, food delivery has obviously gone up. There was this sort of lots of memes and jokes going around early in the quarantine that everyone was drinking so much and how we were all becoming alcoholics. And then finally the data came out, liquor stores are selling a lot more alcohol. But the amount of alcohol being sold is actually the same. It's been flat. We're just buying at liquor stores rather than restaurants and bars, right? Which when you think about it, is logical. So one huge factor is demand increasing or decreasing? I mean, more often decreasing, but in some cases it's not even just holding steady, it actually is increasing. And then the other is supply side. So is there pressure on your sort of your supply chain, your operating model, maybe if you're a services business. So you may be fortunate that demand is steady, but it may be very hard to get your products all the way through your supply chain and to the customer now. Or to deliver your service, which used to be done face to face to your customers and so forth. So that's a second area of pressure. So those two dimensions sort of break out four quadrants of where companies are very broadly in terms of they're in a sector where both of those are being pressured, or one or the other is being pressured, or neither is being pressured. And then within that quadrant, that's where I believe we see very much that how flexible you are, dynamic you are, which is a function of organizational culture and process as much as technological capabilities. They all sort of come together, is absolutely critical of, again, sort of within that scenario that you find yourself in, how bad it's going to be or how well you will take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think we're sure businesses couldn't possibly have predicted the exact type of change that we have seen. There are some who have been in, some form of scenario planning that would take in something similar, or a huge suppression of demand due to external circumstances beyond our control, and a lot of people rushing now to do that. It's one of those things that's been on people's to-do list for so long, and they push it down and push it down, and those that are prepared best have maybe taken advantage a bit more.
Although it's tough. I heard of one business leader being quoted. Yeah, we've had contingency plans all along for what happens if there's terrible economic, turn and demand goes down 30%, right? So we had no scenario for demand going down 98%. There was no plan for that, and it's not the same as coping with a 30% drop, which normally would be considered, economic crisis, massive drop. But depending on your business model, it may be closer to 90%.
Yeah, they'll probably be thrown out as a waste of time planning for that.
Yeah.
So our next question on this comes from Hesham Ali. I'll paste this into the chat box for everyone so you can see. As disruptive technologies already imply distancing, so remote working, less human intervention, less human interaction. Post-COVID, we expect distancing to increase. How do you see the role of future leaders in managing the morale and motivational consequences of such unprecedented distancing?
Yeah, I think this is a great, really interesting leadership challenge right now, and is going to continue to be so. And this is what I've observed. Let me make just one clarification. I wouldn't think of it as less human interaction, but rather less face-to-face interaction. So, and this is, again, this is one of these sort of the across the board impact that we're seeing across every industry, and which I believe is only going to, again, in the best scenario, snap back, so to speak, partially, but not 100%, which is a move away from face-to-face interaction models. And that's everything from having, a virtual product or a physical product, or having the physical product delivered to you rather than you going to the environment, the retail environment. So there's still some human to human, face to face, but less, to, obviously how we're working. And I think this is really going to require leaders to step up and do what it's interesting. This is a topic I've been writing about. I'm working on my next book this year. So fortunately or unfortunately for me, that means the last 2 months has not been a time of quiet and reflection and reading the classics and tending the garden. I tend the garden on the weekends, but it's been very busy, but just with book writing rather than with traveling and speaking and meeting with companies face to face and teaching in person. But I've been enjoying the writing. One of the topics I've been looking at is how leadership is changing or needs to change in the context of digital transformation. And that sort of flows out of how organizational cultures need to change, and what are some of the sort of defining principles, cultural principles for organizations that are thriving in the digital era. And when I came to the topic of leadership, what I identified across these organizations, and this, by the way, looks both at the sort of digital native companies that are laser focused on their culture, whether it's an Amazon or Netflix or Microsoft under Satya Nadella, which has been a major sort of culture shift. Actually, I would put that more in the second camp, which is the sort of legacy companies, or the companies at least that are making a big shift talking to leaders like Espen Egil Hansen, who's been the leader of some of the leading Scandinavian news publications that have been most successful in the last decade and really transforming their whole media companies and their business models. So talking to leaders like that, seeing what they've done, leadership to survive and really to thrive in the digital era, even before this, has to become much less about the old sort of Frederick Winslow Taylor model of top-down hierarchy, command and control, create these sort of linear silo-driven cascading of orders and defining of goals and telling people what to do. For organizations, it's simply not. I mean, in the words of Jeff Bezos, this isn't a quote, but basically what he said early on in his company was, if everyone has to keep bringing decisions to me, we're never going to be fast enough. And so he focused very early on pushing decision-making down. They use the phrase, if you think of an org chart and it's sort of like the tendrils of a tree or the roots or branches of a plant, they talk about Amazon as pushing decisions down to the lowest leaf node of the org chart. So it's like the very, very about, trying to push decision-making down. So this is one of these defining characteristics of these organizations. So what does that mean the leader does, right? And what I have seen is really the leader's role is fundamentally about aligning people. I think it was Steve Jobs who basically said, I don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. I hire smart people so that they will tell me what we should do. But it's not that Jobs sort of was passive. Jobs was very clear on his role was to define the big picture, right? What is the big picture? What is the company trying to do? What are your sort of guiding principles, but also what's your strategy? What do we see right now as the key strategic, areas that we are going to focus on, where we're going to compete, the opportunities that matter most to us. So really sort of, classic business strategy. So that is still very much in the role of the leader. So you have to define that. And then this is the really critical thing, and a lot of research has shown in the last few years, the importance of alignment. So that can't be a cabal of sort of strategists at the top of the company figure things out, and then they just keep the strategy to themselves and whisper directions to everyone. Every single person in the organization has to understand that strategic direction, because they actually have to be able to take initiative, make decisions, and in some cases when the decision is above their sort of pay grade, bring up information, say, hey, I know we think the best way to achieve this goal is to launch this kind of a product, but every time I talk to the customers, they say, no, that won't work for them. Do you think we need to go back and do another stage of customer discovery on this product extension? Maybe we need to go to market a little differently. So getting that participation from the bottom. So really, how do we drive alignment? And these are the 4 jobs of the leader, which I've concluded from studying this, is the leader has to first define. So that is to define what is our strategy, what is our sort of reason why, our calling, our mission, our sort of our guiding vision of where we're heading, what are the strategic areas of opportunity, et cetera. So defining the kind of big picture. There's various things that go into that, but you have to define that. This may include a culture shift. So when Satya Nadella came into Microsoft, it was partly about defining the new strategy and sort of clarifying what it meant to be a sort of a cloud first future for Microsoft from a strategy and product sort of point of view. But he also did a lot of talking about defining how the culture was going to change, and not just saying, oh, it's going to change, but having a few specific ideas, repeating them and being really clear about them. Repeating comes to the second job. So one is you've got to define it. The second is communicate it. And whereas commonly phrased, communicate, communicate, communicate. Like never stop communicating. Really effective leaders are constantly communicating at every level to every stakeholder, first of all, with their own employees, but also to the market and so forth, defining, repeating what that vision is. Third is to empower. When I see really well-run, effective organizations, and I talk to people who are, not the CEO, whenever I ask them, people who are doing great things, say, what does your boss do? How do they, what's the most important thing that they do? The most common thing I hear is they enable me. Not they inspire me, not they tell me what to do. Yes, we have alignment on the strategy, but they say day to day, week to week, the thing they do most is they clear out roadblocks. I'm trying to push the strategy forward. Their main thing they can do, and which they do, which is so valuable, is when they spot, there's a problem, misalignment. Somebody's not getting me what I need. There's a process we used to do a certain way, but now it's holding me back. Empowering. So leaders have to take all kinds of steps to empower those under them to actually pursue that strategy you've defined. And lastly is to embody it. This is sometimes talked about as, talking the talk, not just walking, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. That's an American English expression, or maybe it's a global English expression, or role modeling. But and that's certainly part of it. But a part of it is also simply you've got to apply those same principles, the strategy, and so forth to every decision you make. Because as much as it's important, there are certain moments every, if not every day, every quarter, certainly every year, where the leader has a chance, they do something which shows that they're living by the same principles as they're espousing. Most of what you're doing as a leader is actually, making decisions. And that's where you have to embody it. Who you're hiring, right? Do they align with the culture you're defining, or the mission you're defining, the strategy you're defining? Where you're allocating resources, how you are choosing to make trade-offs, all those decisions you make as a leader in the areas that you are controlling. So that to me is really what we need. Coming back to Hesham's question, that's what leaders need now more than ever. And that is also what drives morale and motivation. I mean, there's some very clear evidence that alignment is the biggest factor that drives employee morale. I mean, it's not the only one. There are others that sort of build and fit into it, but that actually employees feeling that they have a clear sense of what the company is trying to do and that their work is somehow contributing to it. That is the biggest factor affecting employee retention, voluntary retention, people not voluntarily choosing to leave, which is, generally thought of as the strongest signal of morale and motivation. When people leave of their own accord, then when more people leave of their own accord, there'll always be some, that's kind of your strongest signal around morale and motivation. So I think even if no one would be leaving right now because there's not another job to go for, the same principles, giving that a sense of alignment that everyone understands, okay, where are we going? How are we coping with this? So again, defining what it is you're trying to do as a company, communicating that ceaselessly. And that demand has gone up. I mean, I think it's great within our own business school, Columbia Business School. Our dean has gone from having, I guess it's about a quarterly, usually 4 or 5 a year, all hands meeting with the entire business school all together. It's bi-weekly now, right? He says there's just too much happening. There's too much change. There's too much uncertainty. We can't even go once a month. It's every 2 weeks, and there's emails in between if there's something really urgent. But every 2 weeks, there's a full, here I am. Let me just repeat. Half of it is him just repeating what he said in the last time. Communicate, 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 and then being open for questions. Okay, tell me your questions. What are you asking? But there's always some new change. Well, here's the one thing that's been decided, or thing that's been clarified, or we thought was clear and now is not so clear since I spoke to you 2 weeks ago. That kind of leadership is critical.
Absolutely, that sounds like a very good idea. Actually, yeah. So I'm gonna zoom on to a question, because I just saw we had a couple of people mentioning in the chat a similar kind of version of this question. So we'll take it up in our pre-prepared list. Question comes from Sumyajit Sarkar and Mohammed Musleh, and they were asking, large, complex, and diverse organizations seem to have difficulty to transform. While there is innovation in pockets, generally we do not see large companies disrupting industries. What tools, mechanisms, approaches can be adopted to change this mindset and culture and rapidly penetrate these pockets of innovation and bring them to the wider organization?
Yeah. So there's sort of a couple ways of answering this. I guess let me start with I'll start with the second part briefly, which is I think there's something to what Sumyajit and Mohammed are saying about taking those pockets of innovation to the wider organization. This is sort of a common characteristic. So it's not so much that at this point you have a lot of big companies, resourced companies that are not even attempting innovation. I definitely see ones who are doing it in a purely very incremental way. In other words, they haven't, if you think of a business model as having a life cycle, which I do, any business model starts, there's some kind of period of sort of discovery, which is what startups are for. I love Steve Blank's definition of a startup. It's not a company. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable, scalable business model. And then once you find that, once you actually say, you know what, this isn't just an idea, it is even just a product, it's an actual business model. People will use it. It can be run at a profit. It can be repeated. Then you change into actually trying to grow a company. So if you think of it that way, a business model starts at that stage, that sort of search and discovery and trying to figure it out. Then if you succeed, you move into a second stage, which is this kind of growth, scaling up. Then you get to a stage of maturity or a large mature business. And then at some point there's, a life cycle, there's decline or decay. And that may be that it's overtaken and hopefully the business has another business model or has evolved, or maybe it's sold it off and so forth. So if you think about that, where a lot of the challenge is, companies have been sort of stuck in the third stage, the mature stage, if you will, or they've been lucky to be there. Maybe not necessarily stuck. These are big companies, been successful for many years. A bank, it's been a major player in its market for decades. The challenge is all of a sudden you have to start thinking like a startup, right? You say, oh, well, if we're going to digitize, what does that mean? And they're used to doing that sort of incremental innovation that occurs in mature industries where you just sort of tweak and improve slightly what you're already doing. But I actually come up with a disruptive business model or just even a new value proposition that's significantly different, move into a new area, drive significant growth. You need to adopt that sort of mindset and skill set of the entrepreneur. When they do, and so what's happened is in the last decade, more and more companies have recognized this, have focused on it, have taken the time, done the learning and said, oh, okay, there's some methods out here, lean startup, design thinking, agile software development and so forth. And we can train some people or hire in some people who do have this more agile, nimble, customer focused sort of entrepreneurial mindset. And they can come up with, as they say, pockets of innovation, right? And that's where the problem happens very often, not entirely, but very often, is that these larger companies are able to sort of see these pockets of innovation, but they can't integrate them into the larger organization. And that's why, to me, the real challenge, as I see it, is it's not simply about scaling, right? If you're just a new startup all by yourself, maybe you think of it as scaling. Even that, I think, is usually more complicated than people gather until they get there. But particularly if you're in a large organization, you have to scale, but you also have to integrate. Right. So you have to, as you're doing this bigger, you have to actually integrate it back into the large organization. And that's where typically the sort of antibodies of resistance come in. That's where you have a breakdown. That's where you have a lack of ability to leverage the scale of the organization. And so the scale of the company, rather than becoming an asset, say, oh, we've got a larger established customer base, or we have a workforce who can take this product and run with it, actually becomes a barrier. And that's where I see a lot of companies who have sort of started down this path but are not getting the results that they want, are struggling. So the focus, to sort of answer the first part of the question of where are we not seeing this, or what are we lacking? It's a number of things. The most common failings, which I've been seeing again in researching the book, and I talk about this in the first chapter. First is a lack of a sort of strategic vision. So a lot of companies just say, well, we're going to digitize, right? Because everyone's doing it, because I took a class at Columbia and everyone has to, but they don't get to the level of why us particularly, right? What is the case for our particular business, our industry? What are the factors we have to respond to? And if you aren't all aligned on that, if you're just at the level of, oh, the world is going digital, we need to become digital, you're never going to have the focus to your efforts. It's going to be too diffuse. So you have to have that focus. And then second, you need to build those skills to not be sort of trying to manage innovation the old way, but as I talked about, learning these kind of methods, bringing in the entrepreneurial mindset, learning to pursue new ideas and opportunities in a clearer area, and aligned with, again, coming out of that strategic vision, specific priorities, right? So knowing why you're doing it, having the strategic priorities, and then having that sort of entrepreneurial skill set to be able to pursue them in a very different way, in a rapid, iterative way, the way that startups do. Then having that ability, and this has to do with really how you structure innovation in large companies, and so I'm looking at different models of that, but really understanding the difference between a new idea, which would run completely separate from your current business. Think of Amazon when they were a retailer and they first came up with the idea of going into cloud computing. Well, that was not an extension of retailing. I mean, oddly, it was in the sense that they started trying to build their own IT support for the retail business. And then they had the business idea of saying, wait, we could create an actual business as a service out of that. But that business model was not part of retail. So that's something you're going to run very separately, versus other innovations have to run directly. So you're a retail bank and you've got a team coming up with a new mobile banking experience of the future, but that's for retail bank customers, and you already have retail bank customers. So they can't do that without working with your retail banking division, right? So understanding the difference, things that are going to just sort of be done by the traditional business itself, what I call Nexus One growth opportunities, things that are very innovative, very disruptive, but can't be done without the existing business unit. Or if you try, you're going to get this failure problem that is so endemic. That's what I call Nexus 2 problem. And then these opportunities that really, if they work, are going to kind of be their own new seedling business, like Amazon Web Services. That's what I call Nexus 3. So that's the sort of the last piece is understanding how different. They may all be innovative, they may all even be disruptive, but new business ideas, new growth opportunities, new innovations actually need to be managed differently depending on how they relate to the current core business.
Absolutely. I think you've started answering the next question a little bit within that, but it's still worth touching on a little bit from Christina Irina Bugnaru. And yeah, I think I know where this one's going to go after that last little discussion. But she asked, is digital transformation for a large organization best done from the inside using internal talent, hiring talent for in-house jobs, or is it best done from the outside using consulting companies, maybe freelancers, or would you say a mixed model is preferable?
So a mixed model. The ideal is all inside, but none of us live in an ideal world. So so you want to start with that. What can we do on the inside? One of the critical questions is the leader, sort of a leader role. I align with some of the sort of research on change management that says the best change leaders are either somebody, sort of an internal maverick. So if you pick someone from the inside, they should not be the sort of, everyone, chums with everybody, kind of expected to be the next, might be on the track to be the next CEO, sort of in line with the vision of everyone. You want to find that person who's really smart and really dynamic and done great things, but is sort of doesn't follow the consensus thinking of everyone. They're sort of off there. They're that one business unit that's kind of different from everyone else. So they don't really have the same kind of cultures as the whole organization. So there's that kind of internal maverick. Or sometimes you can find an outsider, but the outsider has to have deep, even if they haven't been in the same role, they have to have deep knowledge of the industry. So it could be that they've been in a related industry, they've been in a consulting role, which has dealt with that industry among others or something. So you need someone who's not too, you can go too far afield. You can say, well, let's just hire somebody who's been at Google or Amazon and knows all about the technology and is a big thinker and They don't really understand airplanes at all, but we're going to bring them in to lead the digital transformation of our airplane manufacturing company. That's going to be tough for them. They're probably going to really wish they'd taken another job. But if you pick, your chief operating officer, who's kind of like straight down the middle, been managing all of your core sort of Six Sigma initiatives and optimizing the current business, and you say, okay, your job now is to transform the whole company, that's probably not right either. So you sort of want to figure out, it's not just internal, but who internal. And so that could be the leader, certainly talent. Again, you want to sort of define what are the roles you need, and then say, hey, let's try to be a magnet. Let's define, we're really making an initiative here. Who are the people? You'll probably find there are people in your company who have that mindset, who have that entrepreneurial background, who have skills that aren't being tapped, who are going to volunteer and say, yes, I would love to be part of that. Create an opportunity to sort of magnetically draw them out like filings to a magnet. The people in the organization who are kind of eager and sort of looking for this kind of opportunity. The reality is, depending on your organization and your history and your industry, you quite likely may not have enough of those people to start, right? So that's where the outside comes in. Basically, there's sort of two roles where you want to think about outside. One is for strategic roles when you're just shorthanded. You say, we need 10 people to put together this team that's going to start working on a certain kind of innovation project. We've only identified 4 people who really fit that profile in the company. So we're going to go out and maybe those are hires, maybe those you've got a consulting firm you already have a good relationship with, and you start with them. And then after a year or two, you either hire away your consultants to work for you, or you find other people, you hire people to come in. You want to move that towards in-house. And then the other part of the outside is you don't do everything yourself. So you want to think about what are the things that are important to the change you're making, but are not, if you are, I was talking to Anand Berger from HCL, it's a very big technology consulting firm. And he said, from a sort of a technology perspective, he says, you've got to think about, you may need to change the technology behind your entire organization to sort of digitize it and be able to get access to data and make it much more nimble and agile. So, but it's worth figuring out what are the parts of our whole sort of value chain, everything that we do, that are kind of mission critical, or really at this point was sort of strategically differentiating. So if you are a retailer, for example, and one of your technology systems is around your customer database and customer relationship management, well, that's probably kind of key. That's what you compete on. That's one of your, so you want that to be in-house, right? You want to have that capability and build it in-house. But there may be other things. Maybe your HR system needs to be upgraded. The old one's too slow and inefficient and so forth. But you're not really going to win against another retailer in your industry, probably not because your HR system is like a tiny bit better than theirs. So that's a good opportunity to look for now you don't want these old, slow ERP kind of systems that take forever to implement. You want something that's software as a service, that's you can change easily, that's modular, can connect with other systems, but that's where all the technology is going now anyway. So that's where you look for those vendors, those partners who say, okay, give me a best of breed software as a service solution to this that I can plug in easily to the rest of my systems. So that's sort of a technology way of thinking about it. But I think also we can even think about that as others. Is this a skill that's sort of something we've got to bring up to grade so we're kind of on par with everyone else? That's a good place to look for partners. Or it's sort of like, and the same thing with strategic partners. Is this the part of our ultimate offering that we and only we can do so well? And if not, well, maybe we should be looking for a great product partner, a technology company, not provide our back end, but to help us provide our, a piece of our solution and go-to-market strategy. All the companies who are doing this well, they are working very closely with the big tech companies, the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles and so forth. They all have relationships, and also with smaller startups who are more closely related to their particular industry. And they aren't saying I should build it all ourselves. I was talking to a global company headquartered in Germany. I was just recently and talking about how part of their sort of innovation process, their digital innovation process, every time they identify an opportunity, and this is even their sort of, looking for a new disruptive business model, they see a customer need and they come up with an idea, well, what if we addressed it this way? Then they say, look, they know ideas are easy. Everybody has ideas. Surely someone else has had this idea. Maybe someone else has built this company. So it's like, take the time, go survey, is there any startup already doing this, right? And if there is, then you ask yourself, do they have anything unique? If it's just like, oh yeah, we can copy the idea and they don't have a lot of customers yet, okay, fine, ignore them, just copy it, take it to market faster. If they've got unique IP, if they've already got customers in the market, if they're further along, it's like, well, why build it if they've already built it and you have the opportunity to take a stake or buy or use them as a partner and say, great, they can provide the solution, we'll provide the go-to-market strategy. So, don't reinvent the wheel because you think you have to do it all yourself.
Yeah, it might be. I was working back when I was living in good old Australia for about a year. I was working with Singapore Airlines as the main client, and they really tried to apply their approach to innovation in the aircraft to every aspect of the business. And it was good enough is okay for most things. The customer doesn't notice those things. Most of the things on the aircraft, we'll let somebody else do all the work. We'll let them launch it, and then we'll look at it and find a cheaper way to do something similar, because the customer's not going to complain about those things. But if we're the first people to have on-demand video, and if we have more legroom, that's what they'll notice. So they put all their money into those things and build
that's
a whole
where you
testing.
differentiate. Yeah.
Yeah. So built a testing center for, it was specifically the conditions that you would find 30 odd thousand feet in the air to
Yeah.
taste the food that they were going to put on
Hmm.
the airplanes. Because that's the
Yeah.
thing people talk about. How was the
Yeah.
food? Do you know, it was
Yeah.
actually okay. And then people
Yeah.
want to fly Singapore. But everywhere else, they said, we don't care. We're not interested. And we applied that as a marketing strategy
Yeah.
as well. All these other technologies, right? We don't need to build anything ourselves. Let's just take it off the shelf. One or two things that will really make a difference to the customer experience. That's where you can really win them over. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great, what's table stakes and what's
Yeah.
the area that you're going to win in. That's a really critical question.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question here that we've touched on a little bit, but I always like these questions, and I think a few people have touched on similar things in the chat. But it's a question on leading digital transformations. So yeah, let's take this one before we move on to a new section. It's a good one. From Elena Borlando and Mayrick D'Souza. What skill set do you need to lead a successful digital transformation? Who should drive the digital transformation? Who is responsible? Should it maybe be the CMO, given that marketing drives customer strategies, the marketing funnel, and the path to purchase? So yeah, eternal question, who should lead
Yeah.
the digital transformation?
So the first thing I would say is someone should lead it. That's a mistake I see in some organizations. It's not necessarily a lonely person. The companies who do this well, that there is a team. There is, however, the structure is established. You may have a structure with a few people at the top. That's kind of a defined structure. You may have the digital transformation may be sort of embedded throughout the company, but you have an executive team of people who are senior executives in different roles who all come together and make big decisions about investments and so forth in support of the transformation on a regular basis. But you need to have one person who's, as Amazon calls it, the single-threaded leader. There's Netflix calls it the something captain. It's the informed captain is their term. In other words, yes, the team all needs to share their ideas and debate and so forth, but when a tough decision has to be made, it has to be one person's call. So same sort of thing. And you need both for making decisions, but also for oversight. You need to have somebody whose full-time job, it's the only thing they're doing, is focusing on this transformation from the top and keeping track of and seeing what's happening across the organization, and also sort of leading that leadership team and sort of making decisions and judgments around things like resource allocation. So what do you want in that role? I think the first thing I would say is it is more important that they have a deep knowledge of the company's strategy than that they have a deep knowledge of technology. You need to have knowledge of both, right? But in terms of depth, it's actually, and that's a critical thing. It's more important to have that strategic understanding and mindset. That is the more critical skill of the two. And that's why commonly, well, and then there's one other factor I would say, is that this is typically, in almost every case I see, unless sometimes when it's the CEO, but in almost every case, the digital leader, their leadership role is it's more about persuasion and influence than about sort of the P&L leader, okay, I've got a certain piece of the company. It's my job to kind of, call the shots or drop the budget, drive the ship, right? Again, certain cases, the CEO actually is the chief digital officer, in which case those two do come together, but usually it's not. And when it's not, the person leading the digital transformation is more, it's not that they won't maybe have some budget and they have resources allocated to them, but here's one interesting insight I've had recently talking with companies about this. One of the most common questions I get is, how much should we spend on digital transformation? Give me a ballpark, like what percentage of our total spend or total budget or operations, et cetera, or a fraction of revenue or something should go on this whole digital thing? And I think that's the wrong question. It's imagining that digital transformation is primarily its own budget, like, I don't know, an R&D department, or or really worse, it's thinking of it as a project budget. So thinking of it as an IT project, like, okay, this is the other way I hear it. How many years is this going to take, and what's the budget ballpark? Are we talking 50 million or 200 million? That's a project mindset. Digital transformation is not a project. It is an ongoing process that is not going to really end. And the money, rather than having sort of a budget of its own, most of the money spent in support of a digital transformation is actually money in all the different ways you spend money. It's going to be money you spend on training. It's going to be money you spend on your operating budgets. It's money in your capital expense budgets. So it's more that the financial impact of digital transformation is it's going to shift how all these budgets that are already out there are being allocated towards some different kinds of decisions and different investments. So given that, the role of the digital leader really the person has to be very skilled at, in the best sense, politics, good at influencing. It is about building connections, building alignment across people, getting different business leaders. You know, your number one job is maintaining the support mandate of the CEO, because you can't start without that. Aligning everyone on a clear vision, and building alignment and buy-in with the board, with the heads of the business units, you know, presidents or however that's defined or set up in the organization, with the functional heads, your CFOs and so forth, and everyone else. So that's your number one job. So you need someone with that kind of skill set. That is why typically, you know, a lot of people tell me, you know, I do see it happen, but it's less often that it's the existing CIO. The existing CIO in most legacy organizations, their skill set is more technology, less strategy, because that's been their job historically. And there, as one leader at a media company, but he said to me, he said, yeah, you know, the typical CIO, they're really smart, but they're kind of introverted. They're kind of an engineer, you know, they're not that person whose real skill is like emotional intelligence and building coalitions between people and managing egos of executives, you know, that's not, you know, in many cases, kind of the skill set they've had. So those are the skill sets you need. Could that be the chief marketing officer? I mean, I see that sometimes. I think the point would be, certainly that would be a candidate if you're a company where the CMO is very influential. So depending on the kind of industry that you're in, if you're a very brand focused industry and your CMO is not somebody who's simply focused on things like, you know, advertising or even simply on demand generation, but the CMO has sort of helped to define the product roadmap, the product strategy, bringing in the voice of the customer, all those kinds of strategic roles, then they might be a natural fit. I would still be concerned, though, that they would see the transformation solely or primarily in terms of how it's transforming marketing related functions. And you do want to make sure you've got to be hand in glove with the CIO if it's not the same person. You have to have an incredibly close relationship with them and with HR, because technology and even more so people are the two resources and capabilities you're going to need to be building to make all this happen. You're going to need to be looking across the whole organization, not just customer facing changes, but also changes on the sort of back end operations of the business. So, you know, it could be someone who is the CMO, but long-term, and this whole process is iterative anyway, as it starts to gain traction and you're going further down this path, if they were the CMO, they probably shouldn't stay the CMO. They should probably, if they're going to stay on the role of driving the digital transformation of the business, you should hire somebody who's going to be leading just the marketing team while they are working maybe across, and you could arrange it that they are under this new role. I mean, that could be fine. You know, it's not that these roles are sort of were handed down by Moses on a tablet. You know, every company must have a chief marketing officer and a chief financial officer and a chief operations officer. You know, it's not a fixed sort of division. So be flexible and strategic.
Yeah, although we do often act that way.
Yeah, you have to have this role.
Archetypes must be there. So we come a quick question from our friends in the Chinese cohort. They listed, unfortunately, it didn't have individual names with them, but yeah, it's a good question. Asking, can Professor Rogers analyze the business models of Amazon and Alibaba? How do they?
Quick question. How much time do we have here? No, good question though. So I saw this one. I thought about it. Actually, so what I'd like to point out is it really brings up a really important point that I want to clarify, which is a company is not its business model. Right? These are two different things, a company and a business model. Now, there are some companies, certainly any small company, any early stage company that has a single business model, and it's easy to sort of confuse them. It's like, it's a great question I heard asked by Bob Dorff, who with Steve Blank wrote the most influential book on startups, the Startup Owner's Manual, and who teaches with me in one of my programs at Columbia, when we're sort of coaching people on creating their own, often for a big company, but their innovation team and trying to learn these entrepreneurial lean startup practices. So Bob, I heard asking a team, he said, well, they were working on this great idea. And he said, one thing, this is great. And it's great the customers are liking it and you're getting good feedback and it's terrific. But I do think you need to ask yourself, is this a feature or a product? And then for another company team, he asked, is this the product or the company? Because you've got a product here, which seems to have some traction, but is that the whole company? Or would this be, the one of a few products you offer in order to actually make a viable business, right? So it's important to sort of think about these different levels. And again, your company may have a business model, or certainly a product may have a business model associated with it, but that may not be the only business model for a given company. Certainly, these are great examples of that. Amazon and Alibaba are the kind of companies that are extreme case of that, where they have multiple complex and large-scale business models running at the same time. But also Google, right? Google's ad business has one business model. Android has a totally different business model. Now, these companies and Google and Amazon and Alibaba also exhibit an interesting factor, though, which is part of their success is not only do they have multiple business models. So Amazon's case, just off the top, the biggest ones would be their straight traditional e-commerce business model, which means they buy the products, they own the products, it's on their balance sheet, they sell them through the web, they deliver them. And then they have a second one they built, which is their third-party business model. Now, from the consumer point of view, they almost look the same, right? You have to sort of, because a lot of those third-party products are now covered by Prime. So it's like, you don't even almost kind of notice whether it's for sale by Amazon or by a third party. So it's integrated on the consumer experience, but it's actually a very different business model, very different operations, very different profit margins. They actually make almost all the money. The retail is much better margins. Almost all the profit is coming from the third-party sellers, fulfillment by Amazon business rather than the straight e-commerce. But then, of course, they have a very different business model, Amazon Web Services, selling cloud computing. Of course, there are others, right? There's the Kindle devices, and there's Amazon Prime with media, and they've got a lot. Alibaba, similarly, you can draw a whole chart of the different business models they have. Google between AdSense and selling advertising against search versus Android. And so, whether it's Alibaba or Tencent, you have these Chinese companies that hold an e-commerce. They may have an auction versus a straight e-commerce site, both within, that's two different business models within the same company. They may have a social media property. They, I think all of them, the biggest ones all have a mobile payments platform, something that like in India is Paytm all by itself, but is Alipay if you're Alibaba. And then Alibaba not only went from Alipay, but spun out Ant Financial, wholly owned subsidiary, to go after even new other financial services business models. So they have the largest mutual fund in the world, among others. I mean, it's just noteworthy. Among other financial products, they have one mutual fund that is the biggest mutual fund in the world because it was sort of integrated in. You sort of put money into it as just kind of part of your app and manage it right within your element. So these are companies with multiple business models. So that's sort of the big point I want to make. The second, though, is that these business models are reinforcing of each other, right? So it's not simply a conglomerate that owns I don't know, that's manufacturing. Here's an example, a Latin American company I consulted for the top leadership on for some time. They were looking at how they transferred digitally because they were very diverse. And they had one business that was in real estate that included things like shopping malls, commercial real estate. They had another business that was in consumer packaged goods. And they had another business that was sort of upstream from that. So it was producing things like flour and goods that go into consumer packaged goods, but also meats. And then they had another business that was retail restaurants. Some of these had some connections, a bit of what we traditionally would think of as sort of vertical integration, you know, up the supply chain from the other business. Others, like the shopping malls, were kind of their own, you know, just another business model. But these Alibabas and Amazons and Googles, they are looking very carefully for building different business models that are self-reinforcing. So each one provides very powerful input into the other, right? So, they're providing data to each other, or they're sharing data. They're sharing the same customer base. And so they allow you to grow. You know, the media model of Amazon is primarily the media, by which I mean, that they are one of the big streaming media players in many markets. That is primarily about getting you to pay their subscription service for shipping, right? So it's a value add to Prime. Now you can also, one of the nice things from my point of view as a consumer is they have a wider array, because not only do they have the stuff that comes with the service, but you can also pay to rent individual movies. And so if I want something, Netflix, it's more discover, oh, what have they got to see? But if there's, oh, I really wanted to see that movie from 12 years ago I never saw, I'm more confident I'm going to find it on Amazon, even though I know there's a good chance that I might have to pay for it. But really, they're not doing that for the sake of, oh, let's be the biggest third-party place for movie rentals, and that's our business model. The whole thing is still really in service of making Prime more valuable and making Prime sort of something you have to have, almost like having an internet connection. Well, you couldn't live without Prime, right? It's how you get your stuff. It's how you see your stuff. It's how, you know, everything comes through Prime. And because of the renewable revenue of that subscription model. So this is sometimes called a flywheel. That was a term from Jim Collins that, and he wrote a short sort of essay on this. Not his book, Good to Great, which is his most famous book, but he wrote this short little sort of essay on the flywheel businesses, which basically means you have different business models. Each one reinforces the other. He didn't invent it. Actually, it was first sort of really vividly sort of conceived and articulated, not that it wasn't done before, by Walt Disney. And he drew a very famous sketch, which was sort of this circle around the different Disney business models, even back then, with resorts and the characters and the movies and so forth. And now each one was sort of feeding on the other. And Amazon very much talks about the flywheel of their businesses, how each one builds the next and drives the profitability of the next. So that's the last point I would say, is these kinds of companies, they have multiple business models, but it's really about designing that each one, as it grows and succeeds, is driving the growth and also hopefully the profitability, the margin of other ones. And so it has this sort of virtual cycle.
Excellent. I'll have to look at that Walt Disney sketch. I've seen plenty of flywheel chat, but I haven't seen.
Yeah, he didn't call it a flywheel, but that was the original flywheel diagram. Was this hand-drawn sketch of Walt Disney?
He's better at branding than that. I think he could come up with something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's excruciating having to hear it all the time, even if it does serve a purpose. So we've got a good question here. I think I'll take this question from Xavier Fontaine. Asking the luxury business, in our D2C model section, the luxury business has embraced a direct-to-consumer model much faster than the FMCG industry. Reference, for instance, beauty, cosmetics, jewelry, and so on. What were the tipping points that triggered that change, and how transferable can this be to FMCG or CPG from our US?
Great. So this broad shift towards direct-to-consumer business models, and saying that it's happened, you know, faster in certain industries, beauty, cosmetics, and so forth, and you know, are we going to see this, I guess, across fast-moving consumer goods, right? Are we going to be getting direct-to-consumer, toilet paper and well, that'd be a great brand to launch right now. You get huge uptake if you could guarantee a subscription supply of toilet paper. I'm surprised no one's tried that, even just as a fraud. A fly-by-night. Maybe somebody did. I think what has sort of what has sort of driven this is, first of all, you need a product that's shippable. So it's trickier to ship, perishable goods, for example. That's why we've seen, direct to consumer. We've seen this really interesting kind of nuance emerging around online versus offline. I talked about it and talked about it as the shift from multi-channel to omni-channel. It's not one channel or the other, but increasingly how do they work together? People want to buy things online and be able to return them to a store. We see innovations around that. Groceries, for example, a very renewable purchase, but very perishable. And so the model we're seeing in a lot of countries that is getting some more growth is click and collect, as it's sometimes called. So you purchase it online and then you drive by and they bring it out to you. Walmart was already making a big push into that and has seen a lot of growth during the pandemic because frankly, the grocery delivery went overnight from sort of an idea that a few people had tried. This is in the US. I know it's more adopted in the UK and I think certainly in parts of China. But actual delivery was sort of not super mainstream to suddenly the demand was way more than anyone, including Amazon, could possibly meet. And so everyone has these sites that say, you know, click here to place an order for delivery. And all you ever see is we have no more time slots. But click and collect is more scalable, right? So it's more flexible. And so saying, okay, look, you won't have to come into the store. You'll feel a little safer that way. We'll bring it out to your car in the bags and leave it behind your car. And then when we go, you get out of the car and put it in the back. That's grown very rapidly. So we've seen these different kinds of sort of direct to consumer. A lot of the DTC terminology has been around this idea of the brand going direct to consumer. So that's the idea. So it's not just that you have this, you're changing the channel, but you're sort of skipping that intermediary. And so the brand, you know, one of the most famous ones was in this category was Dollar Shave Club. So they said, we'll ship your razors right to you. You don't have to go to the store anymore to get your shaving razors. So I think the key characteristics are, one is the product shippable. That makes it easier to pursue this. Another, of course, is it's a repeat purchase, right? So you don't need to create a whole business or direct to consumer for something like, I don't know, lamps and home furnishings, right? I mean, a regular e-commerce model is fine. You want to, and there are stores that kind of specialize in things, e-commerce stores that specialize in things like home furnishings, but nobody needs a subscription delivery. I need a new lamp every month, you know? No, it's not, it's just not natural to the category. So FMCG tends to be more repeat purchase. So that's why we're seeing a lot of it there. Is it shippable though? So again, depending on if it's perishable or not, it's a big factor. And the third, of course, is high value, right? So if it's a low margin product, it's tougher to build a business out of this. And that sort of relates to the fourth factor, which is how much it is sold based on brand or experience versus price and utility. And so in a very utilitarian category where people are more price conscious, there's less opportunity there. So the ones that have done the best do reasonably well on all four and maybe high on several of them. So something like the razors is very shippable. It's super easy to ship. It's not, you know, that's not really a big problem in terms of costs. It's very small and lightweight. Relatively high value, you know, the price for the product. Something absolutely you buy a lot. Yeah, a little bit brand, not so much brand driven. I mean, in a sense, they're making it less brand driven by saying, stop buying the globally known brand that you see on the Super Bowl, Gillette, and buy this new brand that we kind of make cool with some jokey YouTube videos. But there's still a brand element. Other things, I think, so that's really the category. Interesting to see to me right now. So one thing to keep in mind is a lot of these businesses have had growth, but not profit. Even ones like a Dollar Shave Club that wound up selling, they were bought out for $1 billion or so by Unilever. They weren't yet at profit. Now, of course, Unilever bought them with the idea, well, we'll scale it, make it profitable. But the point is, you can make this business model run in terms of growth and customer demand. It's not necessarily as easy to make it profitable. The ones where I think it's more, where it's easier to get to profit are ones actually with a stronger brand. So I think it's interesting to see, I've seen, there are a lot of startups that have tried to create these box subscriptions. So every month you get a box of beauty supplies or a box of this, or, you know, neat things, and we kind of curate and send them to you. And either it's just, they're small things and okay, that's what you get for your 20 bucks. Or they're more expensive, but you can send back the ones you don't want. Kind of like the old record, then it became CD of the month club. Before that, it was the tape of the month club. If you're old enough, you remember this music recorded delivery model. So we see that. But the ones who've actually made money on that, I've known, are not the big brand Silicon Valley startups. It's actually existing brands like media companies. And I know some businesses who've set up to just help you you've already got a brand for your magazine or something. And well, gee, why wouldn't you want Wired Magazine, for example? I'm sure they're one of them, but to send you a monthly something cool, and you trust them and they're going to curate. Well, that turns out they've got a great brand. They already have a strong customer relationship. You can actually run that get a customer acquisition easier, better margin. You can make it profitable quite quickly. And the interesting one I'm watching now is Nike. So Nike for years sort of didn't want to be on things like Amazon because they wanted to keep their margins up and their brand. The problem was, of course, you can't avoid the gray market. And so people would buy any place in the ecosystem where there was, leftover merchandise, being sold cheaply. You can't say, well, it's just in some corner of the world over here that won't affect the brand. Well, guess what? Some entrepreneuring individual is going to scoop those up, take them to a warehouse and scoop them up in Manila, take them to a warehouse in Shenzhen and start shipping them around the world through Amazon, undercutting your price. So they were on Amazon when they didn't want to be. They finally said, okay, we'll be officially on Amazon. And then they said, no, forget this. We're actually going to try to go direct to consumer. So now they have their own app. My son has started to use it, so I've gotten to see how it works a bit. And they're saying, we've got such a strong brand. Let's sell. It's not a subscription model, but they're saying, buy through us. We're going to have a great experience, kind of like the difference between buying your Apple product through the Apple Store app rather than through Amazon or a comparable retailer. You can do both. The price is the same, but Apple's experience is good enough that it's comparable, and they have such a good brand. I use it sometimes. I'll just buy my Apple stuff there. But Nike is also doing exclusive products. They're really doubling down. They say, we're going to have certain products that are only available in our channel so that the customers who care most, our loyal customers, the customers who are really brand centric, they're going to see us as the preferred store. We're fine to still be selling in other places. So that's really interesting. And they're even, I believe, experimenting with not a shoe of the month, but with a sort of like that, a membership model where you pay a certain amount and you sort of get to renew, replace your footwear on a calendar basis. So to me, those are kind of the key drivers that define where and how DTC, direct to consumer, can take off, and why it's maybe easier in some product categories than others and more profitable for some brands than for others.
Yeah, and Nike, they came off Amazon again recently, as you say, and
right, to support their push into the app.
Yeah, really taking it much more seriously. And they've done something interesting with their stores where, because they have this direct relationship with customers, they get to see the data. So Foot Locker, for example, selling their products, they don't really see that much. They know what they've sold, but there's not that much more goes with it. But they've been able to see things like customers in Manhattan are less likely to link fashion with athletic wear, whereas in LA, they're much more likely to see the two things as entwined. So all the stores in the US will have 50% the same stock, and they're trying to have 50% that's kind of local based on what we know you and your district are interested in.
Yeah.
And that's social listening data, but it's also website data, what's coming in from the app. And they do things like get local artists to paint the outside of the store based on what they know these customers are going to like. So it's reinforcing the stores as well, making them much more successful. And then what happens? Well, more people go to the store, they get more data, the app gets better, flywheel.
Yeah, exactly. And that is one of those, that addressable customer data. I mean, even if you're a powerful brand and you are able to get some data, some valuable data from your retailer, retailers never give you all the data. That's their most valuable asset. So when you can sell it directly, that's one of the powerful things. There was a question, I think, also from the Chinese cohort, I'm sure we got to, we'll get to, about Android's business model. Sort of touched on it, talking about the flywheel. Android isn't, their point, which is absolutely true, is Android relative to like iOS is not run to maximize profit on that business model itself, right? It generates some revenue, but it's not run to sort of as a revenue maximizer. It's run as a data maximizer, because for them it very much is, again, you call it a flywheel. It's about how Android supports the other business models of Google, which are its biggest revenue drivers. And that's very important to say, what are the sort of linchpin elements of our company And it's great to be able to say, look, this is the business model that's most central or driving the most profit for us, at least for now. I mean, Apple is moving away gradually. Still, its biggest profit is from hardware, but it's moving into services and the numbers have really shifted in the last 3 years, looking at their annual reports. But at this given time, this is our big profit driver. And then think about, well, maybe the point of some other business models is to sort of break even, but drive and enhance, whether it's a competitive moat, whether it's improving the margins or helping to sell that primary business model, right? So,
yeah, well, actually, back to
a lot of that's about data. To your point, Clark.
Yeah, and how Nike have really cut down on their list of partners. So they've said, if you're going to work with us, our customers need to be able to log into our app when they come into your store, and you need to have one of our little stations. So Foot Locker has gone in big on this. So you go in and the Nike app knows GPS, you're in the store, and Foot Locker can greet you as a Nike customer. And they've gone to a lot of wholesalers and said, if you're not going to do this, we're just not going to sell our products there anymore, because it's not worth it anymore without having the data, without having the customer relationship. So yeah, you mentioned
that's a great sort of sexy example of a totally boring company. And I always love showing the two doing the same thing, which was in my last book, which was Caterpillar. I mean, it's not a boring company, but it's not Nike, the industrial equipment company. And when they, a couple of years back, renegotiated the contracts because all their sales channel was always separate companies that sell Caterpillar equipment. And they didn't say, we want better terms, we want you to pay more, give us a better cut or something. But they said, if you're still going to work with us, we need more data. That was the whole thing. So we need you to share certain kinds of data about the end business that's buying it. That's our big ask. And we'll give you certain things in return. But everyone who didn't agree to that, they said, we're no longer selling through you. Yeah.
Actually, very similar example.
Same kind. Yeah, very, very similar. Totally different industry. Yeah.
So we will. Let's take one of our digital strategy for specific industries questions. We've got a big number of these. We'll have time for just one at the moment. Let's look at
retail.
Yeah. Oh God, really. Take our pick. We've touched on a couple of these already. I think a couple of other people have asked about consulting along the way here. So
here we go.
I'll go with the greater public good. So Shaquille Munir asks, over the last decades, the consulting business has grown and maintained its status through, among others, branding and long-time client relationships. The consulting business is a billion-dollar industry. Primarily, it is a human-driven business. I'm interested in the views of Professor Rogers if he sees this industry staying as it is or being disrupted. If so, how does that take place, and how will technology play a role?
Yes, it's very much, I would say it's already being disrupted. There's tremendous changes going on in the consulting industry. And I'm going to talk about this mostly from the scale of large consulting firms. I think you see similar patterns on because there's a difference. There's a lot of consulting firms that are 50 people or less, or even we could say 500 people or less, sort of small and mid-size. But when we think about consulting, we're mostly thinking about the big players, the global players, whether it's McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, BCG, Deloitte, Accenture, PwC, and then a host of companies that are another tier down, but aren't that different in their business model, and are maybe more regional than global, or maybe even focused on one particular industry or maybe a large country or a few countries. But similar sort of model, basically what they're delivering. And as Shaquille said, it's been very human driven, very much about branding and sort of client relationships and building trust. So it's interesting because when I have executives in some of my programs on campus, people from the consulting industry, I find they're a bit divergent. Some of them really struggle with reimagining their industry. And others say like, oh yeah, everything has totally changed. We're not at all in that business anymore that we were 2 years ago. And I think what you have to do, because it's a little slippery, because it does seem like, well, what's the technology? It's like people talking to people. So, and there's not robots coming in doing management consulting yet. So is it being disrupted, or how do we do all these things you're talking about? And is there a platform business model here and so forth? And to me, services industries in general, and I think this is a great example, I find the best first step in thinking about how you need to adapt, why you need to adapt, and second, how you need to adapt, is to focus on customer problems. Because that's all consulting has ever been about. I mean, consulting is not really defined by the products. And this goes back to the classic, article from over 50 years ago by Ted Levitt called Marketing Myopia. It's probably the most famous article in the entire field of sort of academic marketing, in which he's really talked about the idea of focusing on the customer's problem rather than the product that you think you're selling. And not the only person to ever talk about that, but one of the most sort of influential pieces of writing about it. Beautifully written, still resonates today, and says, the industries that have fallen by the wayside, they thought they were in the business of building X or selling X products or solutions rather than looking at sort of the set of needs. Railroad companies thought they were in the business of running railroads rather than, helping transport people. And media companies thought they were in the business of delivering a certain kind of media, movies or television or this, rather than in the business of, entertaining and possibly educating. So consulting, yeah, it's never been about, gee, I wake up in the morning, gee, I need a 12-month engagement with a team of smart people who went to impressive schools to come around my offices. No, I'm facing a certain problem, and I need to reorg after an acquisition, or I need Accenture because I need to change my IT system, but align my business units around it. Or I need, you've got a set of problems that these companies have been in the business of solving. And so again, for any service business, but particularly for these, what you need to be focusing on now is, what are my customers' problems? And you need to, if you think about from the course, from the Digital Strategies for Business course, in particular, a great tool here is the value proposition roadmap. And you can probably identify that there are a set of problems you have addressed in the past, and some of them are still very pertinent for your customers. Some of them are becoming less pressing, or more likely you're getting more competition. And some of them may be fully disrupted, as in they no longer need a smart team of on-hand personal consultants. There's now algorithms that can solve that problem for them, right? There's now a software as a service that does that manages that transition, or handles that process, or resolves that issue for them, which they used to need your help. But the good news is, as the value proposition roadmap is designed, if you use it right, is to help you identify, is there are new problems emerging, there are new unmet customer needs. And so the best thing you can do is leverage those relationships you have, and get close to the customer and really understand which of the things you used to do for them are maybe not as important, or they're finding other quicker, cheaper, more automated, less human. Because you're not going to become, if you're one of these companies, you're not going to probably become the sort of leading AI version of what you used to do. There's probably a startup or technology company that's going to do that, but there are new problems emerging all the time. Oh my goodness, that's part of the pace of change. And so how do you solve those? And the other is to think about, as you're looking at both, how do we solve the problems that have persisted, and how do we solve the new problems that are emerging? Don't assume that you're going to solve them with the same skill sets and capabilities that you had in the past, right? Even if you're still primarily, you tend to focus on things that are kind of human capital focused. There are new human capital focused capabilities and so forth, and technology may become more part of that. So you have some, like an Accenture, for example, among the big, what is it, 4 or 5, anyway, the biggest firms, they've sort of leaned, historically, they've been more sort of technology / management consulting versus others. But the ones who are more sort of classic management consulting, they've boned up on their technology skills. But a lot of this is shifts in their capability. So I was talking to 2 different students of mine from 2 different, I think it was actually both Deloitte and Accenture at different points in the last year. And they talked about how both those firms have, in their case, actually done a lot of acquisitions. Really said, look, we need to really solve our customers, same customers, to solve their problems going forward. We need kind of a different mix of skill sets. We need, and rather than saying we're somehow going to change everybody in the company and transform. They said, look, it's quicker. We're going to buy this innovation agency that's really good at a certain kind of lean, iterative, testing and validating ideas. We're going to buy this digital marketing agency that really understands how to drive and measure consumer demand in certain kinds of industries using sort of digital and data centric tools. We're going to buy this other company that's a data science and analytics firm. So they've done a lot of, these are maybe smaller firms, but buying in talent to sort of say, how do we round out that we have the capabilities to really be that invaluable partner? So that's really where I see the consulting business going. And in a sense, as long as they have the right understanding of the urgency, that's the advantage of being a human-driven business is you figure out what are the people you need and the capabilities, and you go out and if if you have the resources already because you're in the market and you've got some cash on hand that you can hire or acquire and bring in those people, you can pretty nimbly adapt to it. The main thing is that you need to be willing to change your business model. Don't say, well, we have to bill on the same basis, and we have to, advertising conglomerates have been slower, I think, in that sense, versus management consulting or consulting big firms to say, look, we have to be willing to shift, what we bill on and how and so forth, and not just try to plug everything into our old processes. And that's really critical, because if you bring in the same people, bring in the new people and the new skills, but you say, well, we still have to run the project and build a project and so forth exactly as we did before, you're going to run into friction and conflicts. But to their credit, I do see that there's been a lot of adaptability by some of the leaders in that industry.
Yeah, and they get a lot of information from the briefs that they see for clients and the things that they pitch for. They can see what the requirements are. Accenture spent, I think it was £200 million on a creative agency in London just 3-4 years ago. And I've been to that company's offices. I think my sister used to work there, and the really crazy Alice in Wonderland kind of, the last place you're imagining Accenture turning up, and it had like a weird tunnel thing you go in through, but they've bought it and merged it with a data science company, and now they're winning the Nissan contract and all sorts of things. Yeah. So they've gone wherever the market is leading them.
Yeah.
So we'll take one final question. We're just about on time. Again, thanks so much for all your questions, everyone. We'll try and follow up with you and get in touch with your course leaders as well about getting email responses, because there are lots of great questions. Only have so much time to get through them. As a final question, a lot of people are still asking, pandemic related questions, of course, as you would expect. What can people be reading? What are the places to get a good feel for what's going on, what matters, and more broadly, what are the best resources for digital strategies for business? What would you be reading? Books, newsletters, and so on?
So I'm just going to post in here my LinkedIn profile, because that's where I tend to, and I'll share a couple tips and things I've been reading recently, but where I sort of share them most regularly. On my LinkedIn page, let's see, linkedin.com. So I should have typed this in before. Okay, I think that's typed correctly. LinkedIn. Yes. So first of all, big thank you to Clark and to the whole team. It's been a pleasure having all of you folks in this program. It's such an amazing group of students, and I love the chance as we come to the end to be able to have this conversation and pull together your questions as you've gone through all the different modules of the classes, and sort of, what are the missing pieces and next steps. And I love that so many of the questions are about, okay, how do I make this change happen next in my own organization or my own industry? So it's great to thank you for the questions. Thank you for your tremendous, engagement and participation in the programs throughout. I love to keep in touch. So that's why I always say, please reach out on LinkedIn. There's a follow button. It's very easy. You'll see all my updates, my posts, suggested readings, and so forth. If you do want to send me a connection request, just make sure you add a note and say what class you were in, because my assistant manages that part of my social media presence. So she trolls through those, and I tell her to always accept from students. anyway, I love LinkedIn as a way to keep in touch with former students around the world. It's one of the pleasures when I do travel, and I'm looking forward to that returning at some point in the hopefully not too distant future. I love to, post on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm going to be in this country, next month. Let me know if you'd like to join me for breakfast. I'll have breakfast at a hotel with students and so forth, or just to be in touch. So please keep in touch. And so one of the things that I will be posting on, obviously, as I said, I'm writing my next book. It's sort of very much a sequel, follow on to the Digital Transformation Playbook. Really looking at these sort of organizational change challenges in large complex organizations, and looking at that sort of side of the equation in more depth even. So I'll keep you posted about that. But in the interim, I also share, if I'm releasing that research study coming up, webinars that colleagues of mine, my colleague Rita McGrath has one coming up that's going to be terrific on inflection points and how do you apply sort of scenario planning, her great new models for sort of scenario planning and disruptive environments to things like the pandemic. So I'll be sharing that, I think, later today or tomorrow, a link to that webinar coming up. So things that smart people I know are doing, and also reading. So, but to give you a little tip, so you don't have to wait. So 2 reading suggestions. I mean, sometimes I'll share a newsletter I follow or something like that. Those are great too. But 2 books. So one I mentioned earlier. So this is Measure What Matters. This was, I mentioned at the beginning with that Andy Grove quote. This is a really terrific book. It is specifically about measurement models and how do you think about aligning an organization by defining what they call OKRs. So the objective is that sort of guiding goal you're moving towards. So that's about aligning about what really matters most. Not that we've got a dozen goals, but what are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that matter most to this company maybe this year, right? And then the second part, what they call the key results, is agreeing on how are you going to measure that? And then how do you actually use that in a way that's not siloed, that's transparent, visible across the organization, that drives collaboration, and great case studies. The book is terrific. I actually both got the book and the audiobook, because the neat thing about the audiobook is that it is many of the case studies are read by the person. So he got people at all these companies, MyFitnessPal, Google, startups you wouldn't have heard of, other companies, Intuit, to tell their story, say about their journey and how they use this method and how it sort of worked out and how it helped them sort of align around certain goals. But in the audiobook, he got them to come in and read it, so you hear the different voices. So that's really neat. So that's a great book for that kind of topic, if that's a topic of interest to you. I have one other I just started, actually started as an audiobook. I was curious about it and I'm really liking it. So I'm probably going to get the print as well. I'm going to recommend it. So I'm going to have to hold up my phone. This is called Out Innovate. It just came out a couple weeks ago, thanks to the magic of Amazon. Amazon knows what kind of books I order. It was like, you might be interested in this book. And it's a really, I definitely want to recommend it to this group because of the focus and because of the global nature of many of the folks in this program. So basically it's a book, it's a great topic. It's saying, so much of our reading and writing and thinking about sort of startups, digital startups and sort of startup culture, what makes an effective startup and how do you succeed building a new business, if that's something you're thinking about, is written from the point of view of basically Silicon Valley, and places like Silicon Valley. So, Shanghai, the big centers in China, Shenzhen, maybe London, so Tel Aviv. So, this certain model of these places where you have tremendous technology, tremendous amount of talent, VC capital, and so forth. And how do you build a startup there? And his point is, there are also a lot of these startup ecosystems happening around the world, what he calls it the frontier. And that's everywhere from, Nairobi, Kenya, with and the story of M-Pesa and how it got started, to Jakarta, Abu Dhabi, Chicago, and Detroit in the US. So, Sao Paulo, and saying, look, there's startups happening there and their constraints are a bit different, right? But it's not, oh, well, therefore you can't have startups. Companies are succeeding and there are some really innovative business models. So it's kind of lessons learned for them. What do you need to, what's the same and what's a bit different if you're trying to thrive in that kind of environment and drive innovation. So anyway, I know many of you may be in that case. So if you are, it's a really, I'm only halfway through, but it's really good read, smartly written by someone who's been actually an investor in that space for many years. So he really knows a lot of players. He's able to talk about different entrepreneurs in different countries and what he saw sort of did or didn't work for them. So Out Innovate. Second reading suggestion. So and whatever I'm reading next, I'll be sure to be posting on LinkedIn. So again, take a follow up there, keep an eye out, and I'll look forward to keeping in touch. And thanks so much again, Clark and the whole team at Emeritus.
And I got that Tim Harford book you recommended, the 50 inventions that made the modern economy.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And I just went to find the link to it. And he has a new one.
He has a new book that's coming
Friday.
out UK only on Friday for some reason. I'm going to have to get the pay in pounds to get the Kindle version or something, but hopefully it'll come in the US soon. Yeah.
He's got market or something.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time and being so generous to go through all of those questions. So it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Be well all.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.